Thank you. Well, thanks very much for the warm welcome, and thanks for the nice introduction, Stefan. And really pleasure to be here and to be talking about automated driving. And as a disclaimer, if you want to hear autonomous when I say automated, that is fine. It's just that automated is actually the technical term, what typically is called autonomous. But I won't go into those details because I actually want to get pretty specific today. So as you can tell from the title, for one, it's quite a mouthful. And also it's very local. So I want to be talking about deployment of automated driving as an example for the San Francisco Bay Area. The motivation for this talk is as follows, that as Stefan pointed out in his introduction, I have been wearing different hats as an automotive engineer at BMW, as an academic at Stanford, as a consultant at McKinsey, and now on my own. And I'm constantly asked, when will we have it? And I said, well, first of all, it depends what you mean by it. Oh, the autonomous car. And then my answer typically is, well, it's not so much about when, it's much more about where, because they're actually very different kinds of automated vehicles. And it's a big difference if we are talking about the magic push of a button, where we just get into our Hyundai, maybe, here in San Jose, and I push a button, and the car takes me all the way to my house in Palo Alto. That might take some time. But maybe an automated shuttle that takes you from one Samsung building here on First Street to another building on First Street might happen tomorrow, like literally. So therefore, what are we talking about? And I then thought, let's actually put it into perspective what we have here in Silicon Valley, broadly defined, and look at the San Francisco Bay Area. So what I want to do with this is first talk really a little bit about the status of automated driving. And so the preparation for this talk was going through quite a few revisions on my end. And first I had all the details about there's a LiDAR, and there's cameras, and there's regulation, and there's communication, and there's artificial intelligence. Basically took this all out because that's not really what I want to be talking about. And I'm not necessarily an expert in LiDAR or an expert in artificial intelligence. I really see myself as an expert who looks at something from a technical and a business and at times a policy perspective. So I want to take all of this together and therefore be relatively brief on the status of automated driving. Deployment timelines for innovation. Since I will be discussing S-curves when we will have a certain market penetration of a certain technology or product, I want to be talking about S-curves, which some call speculation, many actually call it helpful. And so this is where I want to provide some additional food to you here over the lunch hour, food for thought, actually, and hopefully food for discussion then as well. And then a few examples for automated vehicles, because as I said, not all automated vehicles are equal, and then actually get to the scenarios for the San Francisco Bay Area before some closing thoughts wrap it up. Status of automated driving. Well, blank sheet of paper, not quite. So in this is actually what I put together then last night, because I thought, let's try to put it all on one page. The motivation for automated vehicles, we basically all agree. It's about safety, it's about using our time better, it's about delivery of service, which we should not forget, because not everybody can drive. They're the elderly, they're the younger people, they are those with certain challenges that cannot drive. And this is really where automated driving should help. And we want to improve those lives. Technology, again, I said it already, it's much about sensors, it's about artificial intelligence, it's about connectivity, and there's a lot of work happening on this, certainly here in this corporation to a large extent as well. And there's regulation, as probably quite some of you know, there's the federal states that move forward and put something in place, and then NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in Washington, D.C. said, not so fast, here are some guidelines that we want to propose. And right now we have a situation that give or take close to 30 states in the United States have some regulation, largely for the testing of automated vehicles. And then NHTSA put out those guidelines, and they are somehow trying to harmonize all of this. My personal take is that we actually see a relatively good development, that regulation is being developed together with the technology. The economy. It's actually a pretty interesting business. If I put on my consulting hat, I could cite these numbers, how many $1 trillion automated driving will be by 2030 or something like this. You can read these things, and some of it I find really helpful because it gives us also some perspective, like when we get in our cars, like today, probably many of you going home later today, what this actually is, because after all, it is a business. It's not just getting in a car, it's obviously about energy. It's the time that we spend in those vehicles that you can calculate as economic impact, and if we could use this time better, would change the economic equation as well. But it's also a pretty competitive space. In one of the earlier revisions for this talk, I listed all the patents and who's leading a number of patents regarding automated driving. Happy to share more information on this if someone's in particular interested. But it's obviously not just one company working on something. It's obviously a very competitive area. And this is already a little bit of a glimpse where we will be going with this talk, the applications. And I hope that the resolution is good enough, but you can obviously see a truck down here. You can see our passenger vehicle here, and you see little mobility pods. So it's not just like one kind of application where we say, yeah, that's the autonomous or automated car everybody's pursuing. Consumers have concerns. And that I find pretty surprising. I mean, especially here in Silicon Valley, probably, one gets the impression everybody wants this autonomous or automated car, and people cannot wait. And then when you see these surveys that are really more methodological or more statistical and scientific almost, and they survey consumers, you find that in the order of 60, 70, sometimes high 70% of consumers have concerns about automated vehicles. It's very often about safety. And obviously, depending on when you make these polls, and over the last 2 months we had tragic events about automated vehicles, then the trust goes down. And when there are great announcements, depending from which company they are, the trust might go up. But it's also something, it's also something regarding security, cybersecurity. Can these cars be hacked? And also what you find when you dig deeper into consumer surveys, the people don't quite know if they will be able to understand what these vehicles are, if it's really something that's self-explanatory. And repercussions, it's actually not clear that we will actually end up with less traffic. And this is why I usually say, look, we're trying to make traffic easier, more efficient, safer, we can use our time better, and then we expect people to use it less. I would be surprised if that's the case. So we really need to see what this means for cities and land use in general. Obviously, many companies working on this, and you can almost say every car company under the sun, every larger supplier on the planet works on this. If it's not directly on AI and sensors and something like this, then you see all these interior companies that do like the seats and like the dashboard in the car, that they have all the concepts. What could a self-driving car look like from the interior? You see this. And obviously many tech players and startups on this field as well. And we get quite a few announcements, and for whatever reason, the year 2021 pops up quite a bit. And then I thought, why is it 2021? It's probably because many announcements were made in 2016, and then 5 years into the future, that it ends up being 2021. Every once in a while, it is that maybe an iconic top-of-the-line vehicle from the premium manufacturers like Lexus, BMW, Daimler, Audi or such might launch around this time. But supposedly 2021 we will see a lot. And the deployment so far, we see many demonstrations, and these demonstrations are really important, and we all learn from it. I certainly learn from it because I see, that is possible now. I did not expect that. And we see pilot programs where we can get a glimpse at what riding on an automated vehicle can be, even if it's rather at walking speed than at highway velocities. So that's my baseline, maybe. This is where I think we are at regarding automated driving. And certainly each of these topics could be a talk by itself. We can certainly talk for 45 minutes about customer surveys or consumer surveys. We can certainly talk about regulation. But I want to take this in a slightly different direction. And therefore, this one detailed chart I do want to show, because that actually is important, the definition of different levels of automation, which is defined by SAE, standard 3016, which is, it's actually 6 levels, even if we mostly say it's 5 levels because it goes to level 5. But since there's 0, it's actually 6 levels. And I assume that quite some of you are familiar with this, but since I will be referencing this, I do want to bring it up quickly again. Obviously, it goes from top to bottom. You get more automation the deeper you get into the weeds, if you will. And the question is, who does the driving? Who monitors what is happening? And then what's the fallback? What's the plan B if things don't work out anymore? And this is, what are the situations? What is maybe the opportunity where it can work? And you see basically on this orange line here where the barrier or the border between human and technology lies. And right now we got well into level 2, which is what a Tesla autopilot is, which is what you find on a Mercedes or maybe on a Cadillac or something like this, where the vehicle can more or less be driven by technology, but the human really should watch what is happening. And if the human does not watch what is happening, we actually saw tragedy, especially over the last couple of months. And level 3, so there's some that has been proposed in products, and I will revisit this, what actually is on the market there. All right, that's actually all relatively straightforward, but then when we look actually at all the publications, and this is just from the last half year where I gathered some media headlines. For one, it sounds like, okay, GM is really getting ready now because they announced the first even mass production vehicle. And then we read something, this was around the Frankfurt Auto Show, so therefore Volkswagen showed their Cedric. And I had to scratch the back of my head, what was Cedric again? Because it was in September, just a little bit over half a year ago, but I couldn't really remember anymore. What was the VW Cedric again? It's actually a little people transporter, people shuttle that they showed. Really interesting concept. And again, it's the year 2021 that they have there. And then Jalopnik says, well, a certain company, Tesla, is noticeably behind its goals for self-driving cars. And then even some very outspoken people from a large car company in Detroit comment on what others in Silicon Valley are doing. And you see there's certainly some competition in all of this. And then in October, we saw Cadillac leaping forward with it's called autonomous, but again, this is really where the taxonomy regarding levels of automation is very important. And then around October, it could be just months away, which was then said. This was around the time when Google Waymo was about to make their service in Arizona public. And then Jensen, always good for a lot of wit and good comments. That will take no more than 4 years to have fully automated cars, and by definition, fully automated would be level 5 on the road. Let's see. On the road, hopefully they will drive as well, but you can certainly put something on the road. And then now Waymo announced in November that their fully self-driving vehicles are here. Need to look up where here actually is. And then that was interesting. That was then after CES. That after CES, it seemed to shift somewhat that, oh, you know what? Maybe it's not really months. Maybe it's a decade. So who knows? And then the last one that I got was from the CEO of Uber, who then said, well, you know what? Maybe these self-driving cars are more like student drivers. And in many of these statements, I think in particular the last one, there's a lot of truth and sense in it, but I find it's really hard to navigate for me as a practitioner, what I would say, what's really going on here. And I would think, especially for consumers, it's even harder. So let's look at a few deployment timelines here, what we have. And this is my view of the world that you also find with some consulting firms. Since I used to work at McKinsey, I certainly don't want to contradict what we did there in a study that was well regarded actually in the beginning of 2016 when we looked at 2030, what the world might look like. And so certainly that thinking informed my projections here. And I basically said, okay, let's put it into perspective level 3, which is the car can drive itself, but the human needs to be as a backup. So basically the car would tell me, take over in 10, 9, 8, 7 seconds. And then that's a level 3 vehicle, which I say is basically starting around now. And then level 4, which is no human backup required, but it's basically limited to certain locations or maybe certain times or weather conditions or something like this. And again, level 5 is a magic push of the button. Whatever the scenario, whatever the time of day, whatever the weather, you can just push a button, the car takes you to your destination. You can read here for yourself. So level 3, Audi A8, technically it's able to do this, and then when you read the publications from Audi, they say they will make a decision based on the regulation in certain markets, which we see already. So it's not just about technology, it's really about regulation as well, but also really what position does the company take, and therefore it's certainly good to have Audi and Tesla not just in one paragraph, but even in one line. There's certainly different approaches the companies are taking when they launch something into the market and with what level of complexity and confidence. And then again, level 4 will be a lot like these automated ride-sharing shuttle services that we will see, and then level 5 talked about it. So what you see for one, that the slope is obviously very different. I see these level 3 system, it's more a convenient system, more similar to adaptive cruise control, ACC, which probably many of you are familiar with. Level 4 is more some sort of public transportation almost, and by definition it's a more people efficient or use of the vehicle efficient solution. So therefore, by definition, that is fewer vehicles in itself. So therefore, it doesn't go that fast. But then level 5, this is what I would call really the disruption. That is the magic push of the button, that all of a sudden everybody wants it, even if it's substantially more money. But again, this will happen relatively late because technology, I think, is not ready, but also infrastructure is not ready. And maybe us as a society, we are not ready. But you can see there it gets pretty steep, and that's where I say maybe 20 years into the future. You obviously see an orange line in here, and that's, I said I would be talking about S-curves. The hybrid vehicle is not quite an S-curve, actually, because this is the hybrid electric vehicle for comparison, moved over by 20 years. The first hybrid vehicle got to the market around 1997, and we are still somewhat in the, definitely below 5% market share here in the United States. Well, is that a fair comparison? Probably not, because one is I drive a hybrid vehicle, and the other one is the car can drive me. It's certainly different things, but I think there's some equivalent for how long does it take to bring a technology to the market where a manufacturer, where a supplier, where a technology firm thinks this can work. This can work in consumers' hand and not just in an experiment in a parking lot or something like this. This is something that we are comfortable to ship, and we will see the customer back after 5 years to buy a new product and not just the product after 5 days because it failed. So therefore, things take time, and this is where some people call me pessimistic because I put this out relatively late into the future. But others call me pretty optimistic because they say, ooh, don't forget, automotive industry is slow. So you judge yourself whether you are listening to an optimist or pessimist. But to put this into further perspective, I wanted to show this. I mean, especially obviously here at Samsung. And wanted to put these S-curves and deployment timelines into context for the smartphone, because it's always said 2007, the smartphone showed up, and then overnight everybody had a smartphone. The same will happen to automobiles once we have automated vehicles. See, it was not quite overnight, because if you go back, and I assume they're like real experts on smartphone technologies in the room here, but the first mentioning of a smartphone that I could find was 1994 from IBM. And then obviously you can read for yourself. Man, I really wanted to have one of these Nokia 9000s back in the days when I was in Germany, and Nokia was the greatest thing anyways. But there were still a few others then, and then here obviously the iPhone came up, and then certainly great products from Samsung. But it still took about another almost 10 years to get to 80% market penetration. So it's not really overnight. And to be fair, these are numbers for the, well, obviously global, you can see different examples. But in Silicon Valley, we might get a different perspective that it happens much faster. But that's also a reminder, Silicon Valley is not everywhere. So if we pull all these lines together, we get this. So a bunch of S-curves. And it's probably easier for you to pick from the legend here which one you are most interested in. But you see digital photography, digital music, obviously. And then you see here in the blue, blackish colors, our level 3, level 4, level 5 lines. And also you see, which is really important, if something gets regulated in the automotive space, like airbags. That is actually the fastest S-curve you can think of. This is all normalized that it starts roughly at the same starting point. So you would need to put it to the correct date. And airbags, the fastest. And this is where we have our level 3 curve, which I said is more a convenience curve, similar maybe to air conditioning or something like that. Our level 4 curve, which is again more on the public transportation side, because it's actually relatively few vehicles because of the relatively efficient occupancy of the vehicles. And this is then where curve number 3, which is a level 5, the magic push of the button, that I see, yes, sure, I give you that. That can maybe be similar to digital music, photography, maybe faster than smartphones. I give you that, because I don't always want to be called the pessimist. So this is what I want to put as some context here. Now I actually want to use those lines and again apply it to automated vehicles. But before we actually go to the Bay Area examples, let's really take a look at what different kinds of automated vehicles we have. And this is like, in consulting, we call it an issue tree. So I'm basically going to build this up. What are like the different options that we have for those vehicles? Let's say automated road vehicle. Nice technical, almost scientific term. So where we can say, okay, automated seems to be doing something in an automated fashion, and it seems to be on the road. So I'm not talking about drones here, but I'm also not talking about automated mining vehicles or harvesters or so on, which maybe some of you know that actually in agriculture or mining or such, there are already quite a few automated vehicles, but I'm talking about on-road. So for one, we can then separate this into passenger and passenger. The bottom is going to be freight. So just think of the bottom here, freight transportation. And that actually does make a big difference. Whether you have humans in there, obviously the safety requirements are different. But also the patience is very different. So as a human, I really want to get here in a timely manner. If my freight gets somewhere overnight, that's maybe good enough. And so therefore, we want to look at those different things. And here, no, I think I got it right. So then in each of these branches, we can look at limited or unlimited geography. And this is what I said earlier. You can do things in a parking lot, but that doesn't mean that you can actually drive from here to Seattle or wherever you might want to go. And that actually does make a big difference. It does make a big difference in terms of you know what to expect or you don't. It does make a difference in terms of you can deploy a certain infrastructure, communication infrastructure or such, or you need to hope that you get some sort of a cellular signal, and these sort of things. And that certainly applies to both branches. And then the last level that I put here, you can certainly drill down even deeper into those examples. But is it a limited automation or an unlimited automation? And that's basically what we saw earlier with these different levels of automation. Is it something where the human is not required at all, where the car can do all the driving, which is unlimited? Or is it something, well, at least someone who supervises this would be good, or maybe where the human is as a backup? And the examples that I want to discuss then in the second half of this talk, or the last third maybe, for one, I definitely want to talk about the ultimate vision, the personally owned fully automated vehicle. So that's basically, I assume many of you own a vehicle in here, and that is the question, when will this be self-driving, that you can just get here into the parking structure, you push a button, and it gets you to your home address, and you can finish your work or relax and start the chill out hour early on your way home already. So when will this be possible? We'll look at this. And then also I want to put this really into perspective with a partially automated, personally owned vehicle, which is, again, level 2, level 3, maybe something that we have already on the market and where we will see more of. And then I want to talk about the shared, fully automated passenger shuttles. The difference there being it's really a limited geography, again, where I say feasible to do it here on First Street in San Jose, but to take that very same shuttle all the way to the San Francisco airport, not so much, whereas these personally owned vehicles, unlimited geography. Some of these systems you can certainly use already on your way to SFO today. And then on freight transportation, I definitely want to talk about automated truck platoons. So that's the example where these trucks have a very close following distance, and therefore there's a driver and the lead vehicle, but the following vehicle is for sure controlled in the longitudinal direction, maybe in the steering and lateral direction as well. And then a fully automated delivery vehicle. I think that's also a very interesting proposition where we say, well, what if like the postal service or courier services or the pizza delivery basically gets it into a driverless vehicle? And that's actually a nice thing, and I hope that you agree now to just say, when will we have autonomous vehicles? It's impossible to answer, and it's actually not really a reasonable question because there's really a lot of vanilla in all of this. Like, what kind of vehicle are you talking about? So if we want to go through it each by each, and I'm really putting it in order as I animated it, which is not the chronological order. So I'm starting with level 4, probably level 5 automation. So this is the ultimate scenario, and those of you who maybe have been to some of my talks, I love to show this slide because that's from a book that my parents purchased at a time when I was born. And I will say I'm going to have my 49th birthday tomorrow. So therefore, this is how old this vision is. Actually, the vision is even older. There was in 1969, the vision back then was the year 2000. And the idea was, in the year 2000, we certainly will have a drink in the car and have a great conversation. Back then, the idea was about magnetic strips on the highway, which is why it's maybe more level 4, because this would only work where you have these magnetic strips. But you get the idea. And also, for all other examples, I actually have photos. Certainly, photos were around in 1969, but still today, we actually do not have an example for a level 5 automated vehicle. Because everything that you see, for a number of reasons, has a safety driver in there, often behind the steering wheel, sometimes now on the rear seats, or at least with a remote kill switch somewhat connected with it. So humans are, for all the right reasons, monitoring these automated vehicles. So therefore, we don't have pictures of a fully automated vehicle yet. So there's a little bit of a depiction. You can basically recline, maybe even turn around. And there's a little bit of a summary. So this vehicle can really drive without human interaction. And it's probably the most anticipated by the media and general public. So this is when journalists ask me, hey, Sven, can we do an interview? We really want to get your perspective on automated driving. I said, sure, happy to do it. And they asked me, well, when will we have autonomous vehicles? And this is what they want to talk about. But again, for all these numbers of reasons, it is something like really a self-driving vehicle, the ultimate vision. And I would say it's the evolution of today's vehicles that we have. What it is not is actually something to be expected anytime soon. It'll take time. And when might be expected to be consistent with my S-curves and everything, whether I say past 2030 or past 2035, I think it doesn't really matter too much. But it will really take time. Key players, I mean, that's like as a consultant, you're always being asked, who's leading it? Who's really in that? I'm not saying who's leading it because it's a long time once we will have it. But really the key players, I could list probably every car company there because they all have their concepts and whatnot. But I would say these really stand out to me, that they not just look at the technology of things, but also like, what does it really mean for car travel? And also, what does it mean to our brand if we want to do something like this? Because it does become also brand value. Is it actually consistent with your brand values? And so therefore, I would think what I read from these companies here and see videos and whatnot, probably pretty well positioned. All right, now we're going to what is actually happening now in the top left corner, level 2, level 3. And this is an example for a partially automated, personally owned vehicle. So basically level 2, level 3, automated vehicle with ADAS, advanced driver assistance systems. I did choose to take a picture from Cadillac and not Tesla Autopilot or Mercedes. Stop and go assist with steering control or whatever these systems are called. Because the Cadillac example is actually quite interesting. Because the Cadillac can drive itself on a highway. You still have to monitor it because it is not a level 4 vehicle. It's not a level 3 vehicle, how Cadillac advertises it. But they only enable it on highways where the GM people have actually made sure with their laser scanners and cameras and whatnot that this highway actually works for the driving. So that is a very interesting proposition that I find that I have not heard of from any other car company. So they really say, no, you really need to check in with our server, and then we know where you are, and you might need to get updated mapping information. This is how it works. So this is the idea. Compared to the previous one, you cannot sit back too far because you really want to reach with your hands on the steering wheel. And what it is, it's really these advanced driver assistance systems, and the vehicle can perform some of the driving under certain situations, but you might need to step in every once in a while. What it is, really a vehicle that needs to be monitored by the driver, and it's really more in certain situations, maybe on the highway, maybe for parking, something like this. What it is not, it's certainly not a self-driving vehicle, and it's not your companion that does all the driving for you, because again, you might be asked to step into the scene and quite honestly rescue the scene. On the market now, key players, I put a few more here. I think it really deserves a lot of attention also what Volvo is doing, and with BMW, I'm certainly always biased, my former employer. And, but you really see that this is where basically the car companies are now all getting into. All right, the shuttle. I picked here the A Shuttle in Las Vegas that you can go today and try it out. And they go around the block and you can experience what it is in an automated vehicle. And this is what it looks like. No steering wheel at all. There's still safety drivers in there that can push the red kill switch if need be. But it's a rather utilitarian vehicle and really for short trips in the urban setting. And it's predetermined routes. So you can only go on the route where they have gone with the laser scanners and made sure that really the system knows every edge and every corner that is on there. And if something changes, they need to change the vehicle data to make sure that it's not confused by a dumpster or maybe by a new traffic sign or something like this. And as much as I understand, this also communicates with the traffic lights, that they know when the traffic light is going to turn red or green and such. So that tells you already a little bit about the infrastructure that might be necessary, at least for now, as we really want to make sure that these systems are safe. So what it is, a self-driving or driverless vehicle, essentially. And it is limited to certain operation areas and really for urban public transportation. What is not, usually not on a highway. You can certainly turn this into a bus that maybe goes on the highway, and it might be something, all these commuter buses that we see here along 101 or 280 in Silicon Valley, 580, 680, 880. That you might also have these commuter buses at some point automated. Would certainly be interesting because many of the companies who sponsor these buses obviously are working on automated vehicle technology as well. So I'm curious to see what's coming up. And it's also typically not for all environmental conditions, so if there's really bad weather, they might stop it. Available now, and I really assume by 2020 we might see some real public operations beyond the initial testing phase. And there are a few, well, one name, Waymo Google obviously is very well known, but EasyMile and Navia are small companies that really position themselves only for this. Talk about platooning. What I mentioned earlier is really trucks that are spaced relatively closely together. This is an example from a very dear company here in Silicon Valley, Peloton, and where they have a wireless link between those vehicles and therefore make sure that they are controlled in the longitudinal direction, that the driver still needs to do the steering, but you make sure that you have a relatively close following distance, and therefore their primary goal is fuel efficiency. Safety also plays a role, but really primary fuel. And those of you who wonder, well, wait a minute, why does the lead vehicle save some fuel? It's how aerodynamics work. It's basically you get less vortex and reduce the draft on the leading vehicle as well. So that's the idea. The driver in the back can relax to some extent, depending on what level we have, tethered together via a virtual link, and the lead vehicle is really controlled by the human. It's really a nice example for co-automation, and that's really what we need to see. What we are creating here with our automated vehicle, is it all about just me and my vehicle, and it's a super vehicle and it can really do all the driving? Or is it something where we need to maybe come to more collaborative approach as well? There's actually a lot of research happening at a university in Korea as well for this collaborative automation approach. And what it is not, it's probably not really an autonomous vehicle because it depends on the human and the lead vehicle to control it. And it's not independent of some infrastructure because you need this communication link and also need to watch on what highway you use it. Expected launch, I mean, there's a lot of testing going on now, but let's say maybe 2020 it might happen. And again, Peloton is certainly a pioneer in this, and then the Northern European truck companies, they show a lot of concepts in this. The last one before we go into the actual deployment scenario, so that's a nice GIF from NuRo, which is one version of this delivery vehicle. I think this was shown in January of this year, probably around CES as well. I depicted a slightly different vehicle that you can see by the boxy design who might do something like this. But it really is a driverless version of the van that comes to our office and our homes several times a day and might be driverless at some point. But the question there still is, how do we actually get the box to the doorstep? And this is where actually the drones might come in at some point. Who knows, that they do the last yard drop-off. What it is a self-driving driverless vehicle. It's mostly about optimizing operating costs because the last mile delivery of the logistics chain is about 50% of the cost. So if you ship something from here to New York, about 50% of the cost is the last mile delivery. Why? Because you cannot find the address, there's no one there, someone says, I didn't order this, there's a dog, or whatever, you need to find parking. So this is why having this cost optimized might be quite something. And it could be another talk to then talk about implications for employment and such. What it is not, it's not really unrestricted and not to be purchased by consumers. Maybe 2025, who knows, we might see something like this. And I just listed these two companies. You can list a lot of companies, but this is where I'm patriotic, I think, to things happening in the Bay Area. Speaking of the Bay Area, well, this I'm going to skip because I do want to make sure that we have time for questions. PDF will be made available upon request. But let's look at the San Francisco Bay Area, what is happening here, and actually why the San Francisco Bay Area. And I think there's a good reason to look at deployment scenarios here. For one, basically every car company or every company that is working on automated vehicles is around. Regulation is relatively favorable. Sometimes even like the municipalities are competing, like come to us, do it here. The population is obviously tech savvy and early adopters, so that helps. And we have these hubs like ports, the Port of Oakland, the airport, San Jose Airport. Obviously you see a lot of UPS and FedEx planes there, so that helps quite a bit. Traffic depends if you want to put it as a positive, that you have many different kinds of traffic. You have actually many problems with traffic. Congestion, I guess everybody knows what I'm talking about here. So therefore, you see many scenarios that you might not find in central Wyoming, for instance. Infrastructure, communication infrastructure is relatively good. I don't want to say it's the best in the world, but certainly we have something to offer that we can do here. The roads, I wasn't quite sure what to put here. I put roads are generally in an acceptable condition. So they are not necessarily great, but at least we have roads and we have many different settings of roads, so that's good. And the weather. Maybe part of the reason why many of us are actually here, but it's also, if you really want to test something like this, you will not see snow and ice and very rarely adverse weather conditions. All right, so let's see it. This is roughly what it looks like. Just note that the I-5 corridor is not to scale, so there's a little bit of a gap in between, but I defined this at the Bay Area, broadly defined. In 2020, what we saw earlier, so this is when we might see all these shuttle services for all the reasons that I've been giving you now over the last 30 minutes, that we might see this deploying. I would say Mountain View and San Jose. Mountain View because of a presence of Google, Waymo there, obviously, and also San Jose, I think, before San Francisco. This is what I meant just a minute ago with favorable regulation, where San Jose always brags itself as the heart of Silicon Valley, and I think it's also easier to navigate San Jose compared to many roads in San Francisco. Truck platoons, because of the announcements and also their publications, the I-5 corridor being used for automated vehicles, could very well be that we see those platoons. The growth phase in 2025, more of these shuttle services, I think then Palo Alto, we might see something like this as well. We were talking about deployments like this on Stanford campus in 2013, I believe. So there's your S-curve, how long it might take. And then L4 lanes, so that's the HOV lane, also known as the BEV lane, or something like this, where we then might say that is the AV lane, so the automated vehicle lane, where maybe we have a certain infrastructure, but certainly where we say, okay, in this lane you can do certain things, and the lane markings are really good, which we know lane markings being not so good have caused tragedy in the recent past. So those delivery vehicles, again, I made a statement, previous slide, 2025, we might see those. San Jose because there's the hub from the courier services. Mainstream phase, more of these L4 lanes, more of everything basically. By then, I think it's somewhat aggressive, but let's put it on there, that maybe one of these shuttle services takes me from Palo Alto to SFO or SJC. We shall see. And then, yeah, the delivery services also spread out further throughout Silicon Valley. But really the ultimate solution, I think that's the third or fourth time now that I'm saying it, really takes time that we will see this. All right, closing thoughts. If we get this right, it's not just about an automated car, driverless vehicle. It's really what used to be a car is a car is a car. It's becoming a smart vehicle that can be automated, drive itself to some extent, becomes connected as well, and therefore it becomes an agent on the internet, if you will. So therefore, for first, we see, and this is what these different deployments or different applications of automated vehicles showed, it becomes part of a larger mobility transportation system where hopefully we will also have solutions to make our informed choices. What mode of transportation should I use to actually go to San Francisco? And maybe the closest or the best option is not always the first thought. But then really what it becomes, that everything becomes connected, that it's not just transportation or commerce or other parts of the economy. And I borrowed this from Michael Porter, researcher really appreciated at Harvard Business School. And Michael Porter may be familiar to many of you, Porter's 5 Forces, really a standard literature in strategy making. And he also did the system of systems approach, and that is really very interesting. He didn't do it for this. He did have different examples for system of systems, but this is what we're using it for. All right, in summary, we're just at the beginning of a 20-year transition, 20-year plus transition into automation. Technology progress, regulation, and consumer acceptance will really define when, where, and what we're going to see. And certainly, tech companies have made great progress, but I think what we now also see that the tech companies are saying more and more, ooh, the car companies, we probably need them for all of this. I see more of a collaboration, really applaud that. And it's certainly assumed it's a mix of artificial intelligence, some traditional algorithms. I think this is what the industry is shaking out still a little bit more, where the car companies are like, artificial intelligence, what does it mean? And the tech companies saying, oh, the traditional approach never works. So this is where we will see certainly quite a few discussions coming up, but it's all happening. And those of you who are more into reading, this is a paper that I wrote and will be included in this book that will come out summer this year. And that provides a little bit more detail, which we can also discuss now in the questions you might have. Thanks for listening.
Can you hear me? Thank you for the presentation. Very insightful. I was kind of caught one of the kind of ideas about mobility or mobile phones when the original innovators are no longer the winners, right? So how do you see this play out? Now, the obvious innovator is Waymo today. 35 years from now, 30 years from now, what do you see that kind of lesson? What did we learn from? If you're the innovator, the one who actually comes up with new ideas, but not at the end of the race like Nokia.
Yeah.
What do you see
Okay, let's see if I got the question. I've got a little bit of background noise here. So basically, what might we say in 30 years from now? What have we learned, and what is it like innovators and incumbents in this space? Okay, let's see. For one, I personally am not taking like a one-sided approach, like they are going to be the winners and they are going to be the losers. And I couldn't really tell who is what. And there will be winners and losers for sure, as always. And if we just talk about the different players and companies, on the Silicon Valley aspect, I am really wondering if Silicon Valley will still have the same interest, if not excitement, about these mobility topics even in 20 years from now. Because one slide that I prepared for a different talk looks at the different hot topics or next big things in Silicon Valley over time. It started with aerospace and defense, and then microprocessors and personal computing and internet and whatnot. And right now it's artificial intelligence, heavily applied towards automated driving. And we see that these trends typically last about 20 years. And so we shall see what that looks like. But to your question, if we, or when we will look back in 30 years from now, gee, that's almost going to be 2050, we will find, I'm convinced, that around now was really a very important moment where two different and very important industries got together to actually get something to the very next level. And I was about to say to make something ultimately good. But I'm not sure if I can still say this, because again, we might create more traffic and all of this. But that we're really bringing in the best practices from these two worlds. That we bring in from the tech industry, like a new approach, like more consumer focus, using new methodologies, technologies, artificial intelligence and the likes. But also from the automotive industry, where we say, well, wait a minute, this is what an automobile is. It's not something that you can solve with compressed data and more storage and everything. After all, it's a physical undertaking to move people or freight over a certain distance, and that you cannot really revolutionize with bits and bytes, because it is a physical undertaking. And these two coming together, I think there's a lot of learning. And you can then obviously even further extend, will tech companies become car manufacturers, and existing car manufacturers, will they just be commoditized? My personal, I guess that's a somewhat biased perspective, is probably those with a very strong brand value, like the premium car manufacturers, probably have a pretty good chance of continuing this story. Whereas the volume manufacturers might actually get into a position where they say, okay, if we can sell 250,000 of our vehicles without our logo, at least we sold another 250,000 vehicles. And we then see those partnerships, I think, where a tech player might order these 250,000 vehicles and says, put our system on top of it.
Sven, I have another question for you.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks for your talk.
You're welcome.
The question about the car ownership, particularly in, I think you're predicting 2035 will be level 5 and fully autonomous. As you go in that transition, does car ownership, which is about, I think, 100 million cars a year that are being bought,
new vehicles,
is it going to go up, down, sideways? What's your prediction?
Well, it depends how you want to look at it. The easy answer is it's going to go up on a global level. And this is just because the developing markets really, what you see in these economic studies, once people have more income, an automobile becomes a product to aspire to. Certainly in other markets, and this is where Japan, for instance, really seems to be the leading, it is in decline. Europe and United States, you can tell, is flattening out, maybe still 1–2% growth. But what we discussed over lunch today, the ownership part, I will say, I get wrong most of the time. So when I talk to people at Stanford, students at Stanford University, they tell me, oh, I really want a car, and I want a Tesla, or I want this BMW M3 or whatever. But that's not like everyone, because then I talk to my friends, for instance, in Hamburg or Berlin, something they say in the late 40s, oh, we got rid of our car 5 years ago. And so it really depends what we are looking at, like, is it in a city, is it in a suburb, makes a really big difference. And so therefore my direct answer to you is ownership will not go completely away. I don't believe these forecasts that say like 100 million vehicles a year that are manufactured today, which by 2030 will only be 10 million or so. I have a hard time understanding the mechanics behind it. So that there will be shifts, maybe let's say in the order of 10–15%, and that's already quite a vague statement. But to be clear, even like 2–4% of market shift will hurt quite some of the car companies and suppliers and what else is part of it. So the only advice that I can give is really be nimble, be quick, and be part of it, because it is unfortunately very, very volatile.
Yeah, so there are two aspects of the question. One is around the ownership volume, but the other one is really, does people want to own the car in autonomous vehicle, maybe some mobility service like Uber, and you just use it when you need it because it comes.
I'm not sure if, because it's an L5 automated vehicle, that defies the idea of ownership. I don't really see this, because it's still something that people, which is all of us, we have our stuff in the car. And I don't have kids, so there I really talk about secondhand experience, but just yesterday, the conference I was at, then the parents told me, well, we have our soccer stuff in the car and our camping gear and all of this. And that is something that is hard to put into an equation, in the end, emotional value, that an automobile, whether automated or manual, is an extension of our homes. It's really a part of our lifestyle, like the chart that I showed from Michael Porter, where we really see it has an integrative component to it. And I definitely see that smartphones, for instance, are more important to millennials than an automobile. I get that. And we need to see how that changes once they have families and all of this. But I don't see ownership going away completely, and I would have a hard time imagining that it's split in the middle, 50% sharing and 50% owning. I have a hard time seeing this. But I will say, just because I have a hard time seeing this, doesn't mean that it's not possible. So it's a vague answer, I know, but there's really a lot of color in all of this.
Doctor, thanks again for coming in. So 2 questions, both on how we should be communicating this technology. One of the things I noticed in your presentation and throughout your talk is use the term automated driving versus autonomous vehicles or driverless cars. These are all terms that I really dislike, but automated driving I think is a better descriptor. Can you explain why you use that term versus some of these other terms?
Sure, happy to. Well, the reason why I use automated driving is because it's the defined term by this group that got together over SAE International and said it is automated. A little bit more anecdotal. This is really where I appreciate the comment from Steve Schladover, who used to work over 30 years at UC Berkeley. And he said, no, these are automated vehicles because they automate what we want. An autonomous vehicle would be the following. If I get in the car and say, take me to work, and the car says, no, Sven, you are totally stressed out, totally overworked, I take you to the beach.
Right.
That is autonomous.
Right. Yeah.
I hope everyone will remember that little anecdote, but that's really the point.
No.
Right? It automates what we tell it to do.
Right. Well, and I guess that leads into the second question, which is communicating these kind of technologies is really, really important. It's a safety technology and that kind of thing.
Absolutely agree.
But all the headlines you showed earlier were these very kind of sweeping generalizations, very broad topics, talking about self-driving as it's this thing right around the corner, which I think anybody that understands the space knows it isn't right around the corner.
Yeah.
We've got all these different technologies that are going to help enable it, but we're not quite there yet. How do you, I see a lot of kind of irresponsible reporting and discussion about this.
I don't disagree with you. Yeah.
How do we talk about this from a more grounded perspective, where we can really talk about the benefits of this technology and how to communicate to consumers that we're getting closer to this level 5 dream state, but there's a lot of other steps to get there. How do we kind of be good stewards of this technology and how we communicate it?
It's definitely not easy, but it's absolutely important because we will obviously see more and more of this technology coming to the market and consumers don't quite understand what it is. So it really, I think, is an effort of different players coming together to have more impact, but to also actually speak about the same thing in the same way. And so therefore, definitely definitions are a starting point. But then we do have communications out there. For instance, I'm working with AAA, for instance, and they say we want to educate consumers. And there's also the National Safety Council that actually puts videos on the website and explain these driver assistance systems. Now, the challenge is to get people to watch it. And also the challenge is to get the media to actually watch it and use these terms. And don't talk about robot cars, talk about automated vehicles that can do this and that. In the end, the best answer that I can give you, it is a concerted effort to really get the different players together to really say, okay, we have to get this right because otherwise tragedy happens. And we need to use the same terms and then to really get out the message. And this is also why I do applaud like the Google Waymo safety report. I think that was well written, was easy to understand, and because it comes from players like Google, it actually reaches many people. But in the end, it's talking about it in a sensible way. And on a personal note, when I get interview requests, I answer them and say, yes, I talked to you. For instance, I did get a request after the tragic accidents with the Tesla on 101. And I thought like, oh, please, I don't want to comment on what Tesla does or doesn't do because I don't have any insights. But I did think it's actually an opportunity to put some of the story right, to at least say, look, these are not self-driving cars. You have to monitor them. And it was tragic and everything. And this is, I think, where, in a way, we maybe almost have this responsibility if we know about these topics. And assuming that I got invited here makes me some sort of an expert, that we should use this as well and say, this is what it is. This is what the story is. And not just in technical papers, which is nice, but really also if it's in a blog, if it's in an interview or something like this, or in a video, which I understand this video will be posted. So make sure that people click it.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
You had a nice graph that showed how the airbag was the quickest adoption because it was regulated. And I was listening to an interview recently, and this person said something along the lines of, if safety was our first priority, cars would be illegal. So is there going to be a point where actually there's going to be a push from regulation to only make autonomous driving, or maybe the non-autonomous is going to be considered the exception? Right. I'm allowed only an antique car or something.
Possible. It is possible. That obviously implies that we know what the autonomous car or the highly automated vehicle is going to be. And I think the analogy might be like electronic stability control, which prevents the car within physical limits from spinning out. And that was mandated as of, I think, 2012, something like this. And however you want to look at these definitions of autonomy, it's maybe in there as well, very lowest level. But then the regulator says, look, these systems do save lives. And they do cost money, so we need to put out regulation, not just to make people buy it, but also to drive up the volume. And by driving up the volume, the cost comes down so that more benefit from it. I think it's quite conceivable, but it does entail something. We need to know what these highly automated vehicles are really going to be.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is a little bit on a side of your presentation. And what I'm wondering is whether you have any predictions, ideas, or expectations with regard to what's going to happen in the areas of flying cars. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, the third degree of liberty gives, much greater ease of use. And also perception and maybe localization become much easier to deal with. But on the other hand, is this something that's going to happen anytime soon?
Right. Okay, let's see. So I'm not an avionics expert, but I'm obviously looking at mobility, and these topics come up relatively often, actually. And it's well known, I guess, that Uber is working on it. They call it Uber Elevate. Airbus has set up offices here in San Jose and is supposedly working on concepts like this. Boeing has concepts. But you started out your question with the flying car. And the flying car has been worked on probably for as long as there have been automobiles and airplanes to merge those two. And if that's what we are looking at, I have a hard time, again, seeing it, because you would still need to get to an airport to take off and land. If it's like a flying vehicle, if it's like a vertical takeoff and landing, called a VTOL, that is very different. And I think this will be a complement to our mobility needs, and I really appreciate those concepts, which is to get from San Francisco to San Jose anytime during rush hour traffic, just forget it. But with these flying vehicles, it's possible, for sure in the early days, because there are not that many obviously around, but that then begs the question, what about congested airspace? And obviously safety is very different or harder to accomplish for a flying vehicle than for a rolling vehicle. So I think we will see some of it, but in this in particular, but also in the automated road vehicle, many of us, including myself, are making the mistake that we extrapolate too much. That we say, we know what an automobile is, I know what automation or autonomy is, therefore I know what a fully automated vehicle is. And the same with these flying vehicles. That just reminds me of, let's say, back in 2000, in the year 2000, had I said, I think I understand what this internet thing is, and I understand what a bookstore is, therefore I know what Amazon is going to be. And so I think we have something similar here, and this is why I like the system of systems chart a lot. There will be for sure flying vehicles with people in there, certainly with freight in there, but we got to see how it all grows and maybe proliferates together. I'm excited myself to see what it's going to be, but I don't have a strong answer.